Ben Shapiro speaking about Richard Dawkins. Now, Richard Dawkins came out and made some statements about Christianity and how he likes Christianity and it's good for society. He's culturally a Christian. And then that's kind of set at least my algorithm of YouTube, because I follow a lot of Christian people kind of on fire. They're all responding to it. But I think generally people have been responding to this because Richard Dawkins, being one of the foremost atheists of the early 2000s, I mean, they had a whole gang, right? The four horsemen of atheism. Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, and the late Christopher Hitchens. And they were going around debating folks, writing books. So it's very interesting that Richard Dawkins would come out and make some of these statements that he's made. Here's one thing I will like to say about things I've heard Richard Dawkins say. I've heard Richard Dawkins say things like, hey, I like the language of the Bible, like the King James Bible. I think it's really beautiful, and I enjoy reading it. Now, these are things, it seems like culturally he just sort of enjoys. He just doesn't like the whole thing about believing in God. That's pretty important to him and to us, but he doesn't agree with it. Let's see what Ben Shapiro has to say about the matter, and then I'll try to respond to both of them. The reason why I want to do this is because I disagree with both of them. Okay, so agree with Ben, but I'm not one of those folks who are Christians who just kind of thinks like Ben Shapiro and I are on the same side completely. We're not. He needs to repent and believe in Jesus and give his life to Jesus, as does everybody under the heavens. And so, let's see.
Dawkins has for a very long time been the most famous atheist on planet Earth. Obviously, he's written extensively about why Christianity and Judaism and Islam and all religions are wrong. He's written about the so-called God delusion, this idea that a belief in a higher power is in fact a delusion, but he has simultaneously called himself a cultural Christian. So here he was on LBC talking about his views of cultural Christianity.
Well, I must say I was slightly horrified to hear that Ramadan is being promoted instead. I do think that we are culturally a Christian country. I call myself a cultural Christian. I'm not a believer, but there's a distinction between being a believing Christian and being
Okay, so let's stop there. Okay, so you have to realize that what he's doing is he's speaking within the British framework. And he says, look, we're culturally a Christian culture, a Christian society. That's what England is. That's what Britain, Great Britain, if you want to refer to it as such. But that's what we are. Is he right about this? Is that a matter of a historic fact? Well, yeah, it seems to be the case, right, guys? That there's been a big Christian influence in England, and Christianity has a very good, historically rooted base there in England. And so he's not saying anything factually wrong. He's putting himself within that same category.
a cultural Christian. And so, I love hymns and Christmas carols, and
You're welcome.
I sort of feel at home in the Christian ethos. I feel that we are a Christian country in that sense.
I find that interesting, guys, that he says, I feel at home in the Christian ethos. Why would Richard Dawkins feel at home in the Christian ethos? Might it be because Christianity provides you certain privileges as an unbeliever? To disagree, to essentially say, nope, we don't want you, God. But it seems kind of ironic, right? Like that you've spent a good chunk of your career trying to de-Christianize people. And I remember multiple Christians, apologists, speaking on what will replace Christianity, because it's not just like a vacuum's not going to exist. If people stop being Christians, something's got to fill that place. And predominantly these people were saying, this is in probably 2010, 11, 12, where they were saying Islam is very, very dominant and will fill that void. It seems to me that that's happening. At least that's what he's reacting to. And this has to do with this issue of Ramadan and its promotion and stuff like that.
It's true that statistically the number of people who actually believe in Christianity is going down, and I'm happy with that. But I would not be happy if, for example, we lost all our cathedrals and our beautiful parish churches. So I count myself a cultural Christian. I think it would matter if we substituted any alternative religion. That would be truly dreadful.
Look, props to Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins has gotten in trouble recently because he's made comments against kind of the woke ideologies that are permeating the sciences. And I think he's talking common sense. And I think he's talking sort of the matter of the fact, right? Or the fact of the matter. Matter of the fact. The fact of the matter that if we lose Christianity, the thing that replaces it is really, really not good. Like, it doesn't compare to Christianity. And he's kind of scared of that. So, Ben, take it away.
Okay, but we have substituted an alternative religion, and that religion is paganism, because the reality is that when you cut off a civilization from its Judeo-Christian roots, what you end up with is a paganistic replacement for that religion. Humanism devolves into paganism pretty quickly, because all of the central premises of humanism, things like reliance on human reason, make an argument for human reason as an independent force. You cannot, from an evolutionarily biological perspective, you can't. You can say that human beings are capable of using their brains in order to adapt to their environment. You cannot say that human beings are capable of searching for truth. There is no such thing as truth in evolutionary biology. There's just what's effective and what's not effective. Everything is utilitarian in nature. You can't make the case for higher concepts like justice or freedom if you are operating from a non-God-based universe. You might be able to live that way individually. You can be like Richard Dawkins and be an atheist and be a cultural Christian. But you cannot separate the church building that he is praising there off from what goes on inside the church.
Or why the people built the church the way they did. Have you ever considered that? Why does Christian architecture look the way it does? Because, again, that's one of the things that is impacted by theology. That's very important to think about. I sort of get where Ben Shapiro is coming from here on this perspective. I don't want to oversimplify it because I think generally he's right in regards to the ethics, the morality, in regards to kind of the design that's going to lead you to a certain place. Like, I get his argument. But I'm pretty sure there's pretty decent responses from the other side.
The church building is an outward manifestation of the soul that is the church. The same thing is true of our civilization. Our civilization is built in a particular way on particular frameworks and foundations. And when you destroy those foundations and frameworks, what you end up with is secularist pursuit of values that ends up undermining itself and eating itself. You end up with postmodernism. The reason that postmodernism is a natural outgrowth is because it is a natural decay. You go from a thriving civilization, an Enlightenment civilization that was in fact rooted in Judeo-Christian values. This is why, for example, when it comes to capitalism, Adam Smith wrote Theory of Moral Sentiments before he wrote Wealth of Nations. Theory of Moral Sentiments is an entire book about virtue and the necessity thereof. And then he wrote Wealth of Nations, which was predicated on the idea that when you have a civilization that does in fact promote virtue, capitalism can thrive. The same thing is true of things like free speech. These all exist on deeper foundations. Those deeper foundations are religious in nature. Trying to separate those off, pretending that they are the natural state of the world, is historically ignorant. History is in fact contingent. The Enlightenment rests on Christian bases. Pretending that it does not means that you end up severing the two. And an Enlightenment severed from its Christian bases ends in terror.
So I guess the conversation here is, does it? I agree again with Ben here, but Does it make sense for us to argue that, hey, these are natural outworkings of a Christian framework? Now, again, I think it does. I think when we separate things like the rise of science in the West from the Christian, as Richard Dawkins was saying, the kind of cultural Christianity, then I think it's very important why Christians kind of ask the question, why is it that science didn't take off, say, in places like China and India? The reason being is because these societies had a certain kind of progressiveness to them, but they didn't take off. And why is it that within that cultural Christianity, these things take off? And there's many reasons for that, and there could be a conversation. But in regards to postmodernism, the thing that comes to my mind is, generally speaking, I would say when you look at ancient Greek philosophy, there's postmodernism built into some of the thinking already. I'm not very convinced of the idea that postmodernism is a new idea, as much as I'm convinced of the idea that postmodernism is a pre-Christian idea that has kind of peeked its head back through in a post-Christian culture. So it's regressive in that sense, but the ideas aren't necessarily new. And even calling it postmodernism, being the thing that comes after modernism, I'm not very convinced about. I think it's there, 2,600 years ago, and on.
It actually ends in gulags and death camps near the end of the 19th century. He was making the case that when you kill God, you don't, in fact, end up with a higher secular humanism. You end up with a pagan pursuit of power. You end up with the pursuit of the Ubermensch, because you live in a cold, meaningless universe in which will is the only thing that matters. Power is the only thing that matters. This is why the arguments that are currently made about how, for example, freedom of speech is just a guise for power. This is the argument the left makes against freedom of speech. Property rights are not about the natural outgrowth of human beings want to create and to cultivate. They are, in fact, an imposition by a powerful cadre of people who are attempting to victimize you. They are bad. They're a tool of the patriarchy. Those ideas are natural outgrowths.
That's predominantly because most leftists that make those arguments are extremely poor students of history. And I'm not trying to be demeaning there. That's just my personal experience talking to leftists who don't understand the background to any of these things and look at the present context as to how something is being used and latch onto that and start making an issue without realizing that the more conservative folks that agree with that stuff are against the way that stuff's being used because the morality is off. So even the modern people that are misusing, say, capitalism for, just pure greed are misusing it because, as Ben Shapiro was saying, that the idea that capitalism ought to be within a moral kind of womb and framework is extremely important. But again, in my experience, most leftists are very poor students of history. And those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it.
Of severing natural law. That's a natural outgrowth of suggesting that the universe is in fact not ruled by a creator who created a human nature, and that human nature has natural consequences like property rights, or should have those natural consequences. That the freedom of the mind that is guaranteed by Genesis 1:27, where it says we're all made in the image of God, meaning that we are creative and capable of will, that when you cut that off, you end up with everything is just power dynamics and power relations. As a civilization, you cut yourself off from your roots, and what you end up with is Scotland passing laws suggesting that you cannot speak freely on matters of whether a man is a woman or not. And whoever is in power gets to cudgel the other side. That's the natural consequence. So
as somebody once said, I think there's a book titled by this title, we are a society, essentially, of people, or a society with feet firmly planted in midair. Feet firmly planted in midair. That's the problem. We want to cut ourselves off from our, what I would say, philosophical/theological underpinnings. So Ben Shapiro brought up natural rights, which is Thomas Aquinas's kind of child. And at one point or another in history, we stopped using natural rights because that assumed the creator, a god of nature. And we started using things like human rights, which is essentially the same thing without the foundations to it, the religious and philosophical foundations to it, the theological and philosophical foundations to it. And then we look back on it and we go, man, where have we come as a society? Correct, because we made bad decisions, and those bad decisions are sort of coming back around.
People have asked me many times, can there be a moral atheist? Sure, there can be a moral atheist. Can there be a system built on atheism?
I don't think people should ask whether there should be moral atheist. Like, I don't get that question. It's not very sharp. Could there be moral atheists? Obviously, that's the case. Right? The question isn't that. The proper question is, does the atheist have a proper foundation for objective moral values? That's a more proper question to ask, not can atheists be moral?
Atheism that is moral? No, there cannot. There cannot be a civilizational system built on atheism. This is why when Richard Dawkins says he's a cultural Christian, the question that we should all be asking ourselves is twofold. One, is he right that our civilization rests on Christian foundations? And the answer is yes, of course he is right about that. The second question we should ask is, then why are we destroying those Christian foundations? If the church building exists but there's nobody inside, how long do you expect the civilization to thrive?
Well, why would you expect that the church building will continue to exist? I mean, somebody could go in there and just say, this is a useless building. Why are we taking up random space in the middle of London without anybody inside? We need room. People got to live somewhere. Eventually, what they're going to do is get rid of it. Or, as it has happened in many places in Europe, the large Islamic population is going to buy that church building and convert it into a mosque.
If the civilization built on the Bible discards the Bible, how long do you expect that civilization to continue along the lines it has previously continued? And the argument by Dawkins and other atheists presumably will be, yes, but all that's untrue. Those would be necessary myths, but they're necessary myths, but they're myths. And so truth matters more. So first of all, I would ask, how are you defining truth? Because according to, again, folks like Richard Dawkins, and again, I like a lot of Richard Dawkins' work. It's really interesting. But according to folks like Richard Dawkins, when he says, we can't believe the Bible because it's not true, my question is, what in evolutionary biology suggests that truth is of any paramount value? If, in fact, he's a specialist in adaptation and the necessity of adaptation, then he should be a believer in the Bible simply on the adaptability basis of it. He should be a Christian because it is useful to be a Christian. Because
he's got a point there.
That's what evolution says. Evolution is all about utility. Evolution is not about fundamental truth. But he says you have to discard.
Here's a good question I think some atheists need to ask, is that if religion is a byproduct of our evolutionary process, or they like to speak about it as like residue left over from our pre-scientific kind of way of thinking, but it's gotten us to where we are, and it's a part of our evolutionary process of figuring out the world and having unanswered questions answered, and giving us a reason to be moral and giving us a reason and a purpose to live and stuff like that. Why is it that a lot of atheists are working very hard trying to convince people to stop being religious, or specifically Christians? Wouldn't that bring about, say somebody has the only thing that gives them hope in living, right, is belief in God, and you take that away from them, and then now you've damaged society essentially, because now you have a person on your hands that has no purpose to live, or no purpose to be good, or they have a completely different moral framework, and their moral framework means that they attack you, and they forcibly subjugate you into paying taxes, or become an adherent of their religion, because evolution made it that way. It seems to me that it's kind of counterintuitive for atheists to be trying to convince other people to be atheists, while at the same time complaining about what atheism could potentially bring, again, considering that these are people trying to make people atheists within largely Christian societies.
The Bible, because it is quote unquote not fundamentally true, because you can't prove the miracles, you can't prove God. Okay, but in what world, in your world, why does truth with a capital T matter? It shouldn't. You live in evolutionary meme land, right? The basic idea that genes are self-replicating and seek to survive. And all of that is predicated on a notion of adaptability and utility. It is not predicated on a notion of truth. So you can't rely upon my religious notions of truth in order to knock out the Bible. Number two, why exactly shouldn't it be true? If it is proved that Western civilization is in fact the highest form of civilization that man has experienced, and it is rooted in Christian and Judaic values, there are two possibilities. One, it's a necessary myth, a Platonic necessary myth. And two, is maybe there's truth to it. Maybe it's true. And maybe it seems that, well,
I think, Ben, one of the things that would be here that at least Ben needs to think about is the atheist trying to argue that we can still keep these values, we can still keep these systems that have been produced and get rid of God, get rid of the unnecessary explanation to this. But the response is, can you really do that? Is that really possible? Now, I don't think that's possible, but at least that's what they're trying to go for.
People like Richard Dawkins can individually reject the premises of the Bible while accepting the conclusions. Maybe it turns out that the vast majority of the population cannot and should not. Maybe it turns out that we need more Christians going to church, and we need more Jews going to synagogue. Maybe that's actually really important to a civilization. Otherwise, you end up in the muck that we currently find ourselves. What I would say to Richard Dawkins is, if you like the Christmas carols, someone needs to believe in Christ to sing them.
Amen.
If you like the churches, somebody has to go to church to actually...
Somebody's got to build them first.
Maintain the church. If you like the civilization in which you live, somebody's got to maintain those biblical roots. Somebody's got to go to the garden and cultivate and guard it. It's pretty important. Are you tired of the...
And considering that Richard Dawkins is trying to convince people not to believe any of that stuff, what's the point? I mean, what are we really talking about? I think I've become a bit soft on Richard Dawkins over the years, and I think he's changed. I think Richard Dawkins has changed. But it's, again, interesting. Sometimes he gets up and makes these kinds of statements, and then other times he makes very, very different sort of statements, and you kind of go, where are you at with this stuff? And maybe he's personally struggling through it. I don't know. But those are my thoughts, guys, on this subject. So take it for what it is. Agree, disagree. You think I'm talking trash? I don't know what I'm talking about. Thank you very much for that. Appreciate it. Subscribe. Maybe we'll have better conversations next time.